Hi, I'm Ali Patterson. On this episode, we're going to look a little bit around data and compliance. For this, we're going to go and speak with Actiance to talk a little bit about storing the data, as well as catching up with Saul Judah from Gartner and George Stein from Unicredit. I went to speak with Actiance to find out more about the challenges that we're facing in the financial services industry. So I've come to speak with Brian Perfect from Actiance to talk a little bit about compliance.
The financial services industry is getting better at putting the customer first. It's something it hasn't always done well in the past. I think the financial services industry, whether it likes it or not, is going to be increasingly regulated. And the expectation from the governments of the world is that the financial services industry will not be ever again in a position to put the world economy at risk. And I think those pressures from regulators, from governments, and greater customer expectations are what will shape the banking industry. How they react to that is going to vary quite dramatically across the globe and probably in detail as to what kind of financial services company you actually are. So branches have become less important over the last 10 years and have, people increasingly question the costs that are inherent in the branch. And customers have become more used to using different ways of dealing with their bank. I mean, if you look at how many people have adopted smartphones in dealing with their banking matters over the last few years, it's quite surprising. And I think this is going to continue. I think the interesting thing is you will see people quite happy to use things like Skype, maybe FaceTime and WeChat for engaging with their bank if banks are prepared to allow them to do that. And then, of course, the banks have the need to make sure what they do on those channels is compliant.
So I've come to Unicredit to speak to George Stein about global transaction banking and data.
Well, compliance is a very important part of what we do, certainly in my business, and in following the regulations and the guidelines set by the regulators. Challenges are everywhere in the financial services industry. In my particular business, which is global transaction banking, I'm responsible for the UK. The biggest challenge we face is to serve our customers in this market. It's a very competitive market. Overall, for the industry, you can say that the pace of change and the entrance of new competitors in the market are really challenging banks. The pace of change brought on by digitalization and also new competitors who don't have the same sort of legacy systems and other things that banks have to face and banks have to manage.
So I've come to speak with Mary O'Connor from Willis Towers Watson to talk a little bit about compliance and MiFID II. Let's go into a little bit more detail about MiFID II. How do you think it's going to affect the industry?
I think it's going to affect the industry in sort of two different ways. I think the big thing that it's going to do is make the costs of serving customers transparent. And I think that is going to get everyone on board with understanding, what you have to pay to receive services, but also what services you're getting. And customers will then be able to say, in a way that I think is even more so than the retail distribution review, what they want to get and what returns they're expecting for the things that they're doing. But the other big thing I think it's going to do is it's going to drive asset managers in particular to have costs be in the right place. I think you're going to see the impact on the larger firms first, because I think that's where the volumes are, and that's where most people have their money. But over time, I think you are going to see it in the smaller firms. At the same time, though, I think it's going to create real opportunities for the smaller firms, because as we've discussed around technology generally, smaller firms with more nimble architecture, newer technology, have an opportunity to take costs out of the system and be able to do things in a transparent way that is potentially at a lower cost than sort of traditional companies can do. I think the challenge, though, will be for the regulators to make sure that everyone's operating on a level playing field. I think that that RegTech is a direct response to the need to provide more just transparency and more accounting around some of the activities that are happening.
I wanted to find out how a bank could effectively manage its data and what the advantages are for storing data in the cloud.
They're facing the requirements to meet regulations, to deliver value to the customers and to grow, as has always been the case. But they're also facing threats from a variety of different competitors that they didn't expect. So smaller companies that don't need to meet the regulations in the same way as banks do, companies that are going under the radar, are actually challenging banks in many ways. So banks are now looking at innovating rather than innovating on their product. They're also looking at innovating on information. So they're far more focused on looking at information as an asset and creating value through information and using information to drive new business models than they ever have been in the past.
Cool. What sort of business models do you think they're using that data to really drive? So
I'm seeing new ways of differentiating with creating new products of differentiation through things like personalized products, focusing on specific needs and making the products that they're offering very specific to the individuals. And that requires vast amounts of information. It requires new processes and new frameworks to think about information, and then therefore driving the need to have far better information management. Banks can't differentiate on whether their current account is better than the next bank anymore. They have to look at something quite different. They have to look at how they can innovate with their information and create some value that the customers and the market truly needs.
So most financial services firms like to keep their core data, their core information systems on site, on premise. And this is primarily for performance and security reasons. But what we see is as you move away from those core systems, and an example might be the email system, people are increasingly considering using the cloud. And as people move their email into the cloud, they start to move the archiving and compliance for those cloud functions into the cloud as well.
Well, big data is an interesting concept. It's sort of I think of it as a new name for something that we've always dealt with. We're banks. If you look at a bank like Unicredit, how many transactions we process a day, it's all data. So we already do big data. We have an amazing wealth of knowledge about our customers that we use to do things like what we're doing in London, like to develop new products and new capabilities to serve our clients better. So if you look around the Unicredit network and just look at the sheer volume of transactions we do, that gives us a lot of knowledge of our customers. On the customer side, to turn that equation around is a huge challenge because customers are traditionally used to receiving data from their banks about their activities, but sitting down with customers and working out exactly how to use all the additional data that they're maybe not used to looking at traditionally, things that go beyond sort of daily reporting and balance and transaction reporting. That's a challenge for our customers as well as for us. How do you use all this data? What is there that is relevant for me? What's relevant for one client may not be relevant for another client. So how do you tap into this flow of data that the bank already has? That's a challenge for us, but it's a challenge for the clients as well. Years and years ago, the chairman of Citibank said, money is information on the move. He got it right, and this was almost 30 years ago. And I think looking into the future back then, no one could imagine the bandwidth and the processing capability that market participants have these days. So there's a lot there to work with. And again, the challenge is for customers to understand what's available and how they think they can use it. And our challenge is to follow our customers in that endeavor.
After hearing about storing certain data on site for security reasons, I wanted to learn a little bit about how the cloud can be used to break down barriers between various silos.
Actually, our business of archiving and compliance is quite a good example of how the cloud can do that. I mean, in the past, there used to be just email. And then all the various different types of electronic messaging came along. Examples would be instant messaging, unified communications, financial networks like Bloomberg and Reuters, then you've got collaboration platforms, enterprise social, and then public social. So what has actually happened is the compliance and archiving of all those individual channels, as we would call them, has been done by different systems. So people end up with a real sort of dog's dinner of systems, which is expensive. With Alcatraz, you can bring all that data together in the cloud, which means you can access it better, so you can perform e-discovery and supervision with a single pane of glass across all of the channels, which has tremendous business benefits. Okay. The other side, of course, is by having a single system, we would always lower the total cost of ownership.
For me personally, the cloud is an interesting concept. There really, in my view, there really is not a cloud. It's really just someone else's computer. If you look at it that way, then banks have been doing this sort of thing for years in the course of our normal business. We right now at Unicredit run systems that consolidate data and consolidate processing for customers across a really broad geography. We're doing the same thing in London. We will be introducing some new capabilities this year and next year, which will not be bespoke developments in the UK, but we will leverage off of investments that the bank is making in centralized developments that our customers here will benefit from. And that's the power of working for a bank like Unicredit with the kind of reach and the kind of investments that we're making.
As a lawyer, I can't underestimate the importance of record retention. The struggle with record retention is actually finding the right records when you're looking for things. The issue now when you're running compliance, or if you're a lawyer in a big company, is there's so much noise. So figuring out the things that you need to look for, I think, is the most important thing. So to me, one of the big ways that we can change things for the better is by being able to search unstructured data better, having better ways of storing information so that it's easily retrievable. And again, it's this telematics concept, the concept of looking at information now to decide if there's something wrong or something right about it, or how can we improve things based on what we know now, as well as just storing it. Yeah, obviously there's real privacy issues in there, and there's also the issues of stifling innovation. You can't have someone whose job is not serving the customer necessarily being the one who vets this. So I think there is a real struggle for companies around this issue. But at the same time, I think this is where the difference in regulation between the US and the UK really plays out. Because in the UK, if you don't save something, it's almost there's almost an expectation that somehow that's wrong. So there's a real burden on companies to try to save everything. I think the big thing for companies when you step back from it is to say, what am I trying to do here? I'm trying to help the customer, I'm trying to serve the customer better, and I'm trying to understand my risks. And so I think if you have a program that is based on those things, and that gives you an opportunity to be able to retrieve data in a meaningful way, and that lets you interrogate data periodically, that's the key. So that you have an explanation if things go wrong, that you can say, I did this in a meaningful way. Because I do think it's impossible to save everything, and there are a lot of good reasons why there's some things you might not want to save.
I wanted to find out about data from social media as well.
So social media is just another form of electronic communication as far as the regulator is concerned. Okay. And if anything that happens on social media leads or is pertinent to a business transaction, then it has to be captured, monitored, archived in the same way that email or other forms of instant messaging have to be controlled. In terms of the second point you make, it's all the startups are regulated by the Financial Conduct Authority in the UK and other regulators across Europe in the same way that large financial services firms are. So they have to take that into account, and I guess Nutmeg is an online wealth management service, as I recall, and is unusual in that respect, in that wealth management is a very personal, relationship-based business. But I would think that they would have to be particularly careful if they're making use of some of the more modern social or unified communications techniques like things like Skype. Well, I think it stems from two things. There's the financial crisis from around 2008, and then the LIBOR and the foreign exchange scandals of more recent years. And what this means is the regulators have become much more active. They've increased regulation to try and make the markets safer, to try and prevent market abuse and to protect investors. All this leads to cost for banks and other financial firms. Well, I think in terms of new entrants and regulation, they have to follow the same regulatory regime that the large banks do, by and large. I mean, obviously, there are different regulations for the very largest firms. So I don't think anyone has an advantage or a disadvantage. Everyone is, most people anyhow, are regulated by the Financial Conduct Authority.
On the next episode of Fintech Finance, we have a look at the future of the branch and a bank's physical presence in their customers' lives.